In 2015, Kevin Feige announced the glorious return of Spider-Man to the MCU. Marvel's favorite son had returned home and would be starring in Captain America Civil War. All of us that had been comic book fans for the longest knew what this meant, and we were overjoyed about the entire thing with the one exception, and that exception is the origin story. See, as us nerds, we had been tied into everything for so long. We'd seen the origin story from the very humble beginnings in 1963 in Amazing Fantasy 15 to the first movie on the big screen in 2002 to the reboot in 2012, and now here we go again with Spider-Man returning to the screens. We did not want to see it told another time. And maybe the talking heads in MCU heard our collective groan when thinking about having to see the origin story a third time on the big screen and decided not to show us and throw us right into the thick of things from get-go. But I think that instead of honoring our wishes, not only did they put in an honest-to-goodness origin story for Peter Parker, but they also gave us a metaphorical Uncle Ben. And I'm going to tell you exactly how that happened right now. I know you're waiting for all that Spider-Man goodness, but right before we get into it, I just want to thank you for clicking on this video. And if you enjoy this sort of thing, go ahead and click that subscribe button. Also hit that notification bell if you want to know as soon as I upload anything. To rewind the clock, back in 2002, Tobey Maguire portrayed the role of Spider-Man, and Cliff Robertson was the Uncle Ben to his Peter Parker. And we had one of the most faithful iterations from the comic book page to screen. In 2012, we also had another one in The Amazing Spider-Man. This time, the role of Spider-Man and Peter Parker was played by Andrew Garfield, and Uncle Ben was played by Martin Sheen. Once again, we get something not as literal a translation, but we get something that is very much fitting of the soul of the character. Both of these movies depict the origin of Peter Parker as if it's directly ripped from Amazing Fantasy 15. Of course, everybody who knows Spider-Man knows the origin story. He was bitten by a radioactive spider and gained the proportionate strengths of a spider. And in doing so, he got a little cocky and wanted to make some money off of this. But unfortunately to him, because he wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing, his uncle was shot and killed. This uncle was not just an uncle to him, but it was a father figure as well. And as the curtain rises on our young Peter Parker in Captain America Civil War, we are bypassing all of the spider bites and Uncle Bens, and we're getting right into the power and responsibility of the character, somewhat streamlining the experience, because we've seen this before twice in the matter of 13 years. But what if I told you that the MCU snuck in a much more lengthened origin story, and they did it beat by beat, not to the Amazing Fantasy 15, but to 2000's Ultimate Spider-Man by Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley. To really get the direct correlations, you have to understand that you can't relate the powers to powers, and you can't relate Uncle Ben to Uncle Ben. Because he already has his powers, and his Uncle Ben has already passed, there are direct correlations to other things, and they are direct. In this case, his powers relate to the suit that Tony Stark gave him, and Uncle Ben is a direct correlation to Tony Stark himself. In 2015's Captain America Civil War, Tony Stark shows up at his apartment, the one that he shares with his Aunt May, and he understands who Peter is and what he's been doing. Peter gives him the whole, if you don't do things and you can stop them, then that's on you, kind of like a loose power and responsibility translation. But it is in this scene where we get the setup for Peter getting the power, metaphorically, his suit. And when he gets his suit, he now feels imbued, he now feels emboldened. But in issue 1 of Ultimate Spider-Man, that is when he gets bitten by the spider and gains these powers. He doesn't really get to explore his powers until issue number 2. And in this case, this is a direct correlation to Spider-Man Homecoming. Back in 2016, when the webhead got his first standalone MCU movie, this was him going through and being a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and he was getting used to his powers. Not his actual superpowers, but the suit. He even bypasses some of the safeguards of the suit and gets to really explore what he can do, which is akin to what happened in Ultimate Spider-Man issue number 2. After this point, it starts getting a little bit fuzzy, and I may be taking a few liberties, so just understand that if it's not as direct as those first two examples, just forgive me for the sake, because where I'm getting to, it does pay off. In the comic book Ultimate Spider-Man issue number 3, he starts to become a little bit more full of himself. He actually starts doing some of the underground wrestling to make some money on the side. There's not a direct correlation to this in the third instance of Peter showing up in the MCU. That would be Avengers Infinity War. But there is something that does happen that is a direct correlation. In the comics, he does get a little full of himself, and he starts to become a little bit rebellious. And even though it is not as strong as it is in the comics, Peter does something that he's not supposed to do. During the fight in New York, when he has to chase Ebony Maw and Doctor Strange, he gets onto the spaceship and Tony tells him, get back down to the ground. He disobeys Tony, and he gets up there, and Tony is rightfully upset about it because he feels like Peter is his responsibility, as was shown in Spider-Man Homecoming. Albeit, this has happened and now he has to make the best of the situation. And then they get to fight Thanos on Titan. And there's a sequence where they're trying to take the gauntlet from him. Mantis has Thanos somewhat sedated and everybody has him tied down. And Tony and Peter are trying to work the gauntlet off of him. In comes Star-Lord, but that's a whole other issue. Star-Lord, it's all your fault. And right before they successfully get the gauntlet from him, and technically not they, but right as Peter gets the gauntlet off his hand, Thanos wakes up and takes the gauntlet. And this is the moment where Peter fails. This is the moment where his powers were not enough. A few minutes later, they all get dusted. And this leads us to Avengers Endgame. We're not talking about the 5-year break. What we are talking about, the fight on Earth at the Avengers compound with Thanos. Peter returns. Tony is elated. Tony is happy that Peter is back because at this point, during that 5-year span that Peter is not there for, Tony has looked at Peter as his surrogate son. And when he finally sees him, he hugs him and he embraces him, which was a callback to Spider-Man Homecoming. It's one of my favorite moments of Endgame. But fast forward to the end of the fight, Tony lays down his life to defeat Thanos, and this is where we get the direct Uncle Ben allegory. Because of Peter's failure to retrieve the gauntlet from Thanos, and in Peter's mind, this only happened 30 to 40 minutes ago. But because of his failure, his mentor, his father figure, surrogate father figure, but father figure nonetheless, dies. And he feels like it's all on him. And the death of his father figure is exactly what happens at the end of issue 4 in Ultimate Spider-Man. Now coming on to issue 5 of Ultimate Spider-Man, you have Peter kind of dealing with the grief and the ramifications of his lack of action or his lack of enough action. And you see him going through stages of depression and loss. And this is what happens in Spider-Man Far From Home. You get to see this entire 5-issue arc from Ultimate Spider-Man, the origin of Spider-Man, laid out to you in movie form through 5 movies over the course of 4 years. And we said we didn't want an origin story, but what we got was so much bigger than just any old origin story. But you have your metaphorical powers in the form of the suit that Tony gives Peter. You have your metaphorical Uncle Ben in the role of Tony Stark. And you have the grief that happens whenever Peter feels like he did not act as well as he should have. So there you have it, my rationale on why I think the MCU snuck in an origin story for Peter Parker and, in the same vein, Spider-Man. Let me know what you guys think about this whole thing in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, and if you're new here, subscribe to the channel. Share this with your friends, and as always, this is Cameron with CBM Reviews. We'll see you next time.